You're listening to the We Are Libertarians podcast network. Find all of our shows at wearelibertarians.com.
This episode is brought to you by Temptations Cat Treats. Your cat will come running for the perfectly irresistible Temptations Creamy Puree and Temptations Lickable Spoon Cat Treats. The best time to feed lickable cat treats to your cat is anytime. Feed by hand for a playful moment, in a bowl for a creamy treat, or as a topper to make mealtime fun. Visit temptationstreats.com to learn more.
Get ready for Netflix's gripping new medical drama, Pulse. Set in a cutting-edge Miami trauma center, third-year resident Dr. Danny Sims is unexpectedly thrust into a promotion when beloved chief resident Dr. Xander Phillips gets suspended. Then, with the emotional and physical stakes at their highest, a storm will push the hospital and its residents to their limits. Witness how life can change in a heartbeat when you're operating under pressure. Watch Pulse April 3rd, only on Netflix.
Welcome to the Chris Spangle Show. Thank you for joining me here on the program. And I've got such a fun discussion today. We just wrapped it up. I'm recording this here at the end. It's a little peek behind the curtain. I talk to the person, and then I do the intro to tell you what we talk about. Otherwise, I'd just be what's the thing? I can't think of the word. Anyways, let's get on with the podcast here. I'm talking about Cuba today. I like most of you probably thought Cuba was like becoming more free and was opening up. You know, Barack Obama made it. He did something to make it better. He opened it up so we could go to Canada or to Cuba. Excuse me, Canada, Cuba. They're all communist paradises, right? But my guest today, Gaby Blanco, is a speaker for the Dissident Project and the Gideons International, as well as a member of Ladies of Liberty and a Young Voices contributor. And I was sent her article. I work with Young Voices. They pitch me various people. And I don't work with them. They just pitch me people, and then I interview anybody I find interesting. And she wrote an article about Cuba and the Vatican doing a deal with the United States. And I read it, and I was like, wait, Canada or Cuba is not free. I really wanted to have her on to talk about Cuba. This stinks. Welcome to the Chris Spangle Show. Thanks so much for joining me. I am so excited for you to listen to this conversation today. I had on Gaby Blanco, who is a speaker for the Dissident Project and the Gideons International, as well as a member of Ladies for Liberty and a Young Voices contributor. And they sent me her article, Cuba and the Vatican Deal in the Face of U.S. Elections, at realclearworld.com. And I was fascinated to read about the situation in Cuba because I, like most of you, thought, well, Barack Obama opened it up in 2014. They must just be enjoying the fruits of liberty now. And that is not the case. So I talked with Gaby about a lot of stuff. I loved our conversation, and I thought it was so interesting about the situation in Cuba. What is life like there every day in a communist country? How are Christians treated? She shares a little bit about her testimony of coming to faith. And then we talk about, her view of American politics as somebody that is a recent American. So stay tuned. I think you'll really enjoy it. Here is my interview with Gaby Blanco. Gaby Blanco, thank you so much for joining me here on the show. I'm so excited, just based on the pre-interview, just to hear your story. And we're talking about Cuba, obviously. Why is Cuba an important part of this story? Why you chose to write this article?
Well, I'm born and raised in Cuba. I've lived there until I was 24. I'm a Christian now, as of 2021. And Cuba is a huge part of my story because of what it represents in the hemisphere and the world as well. It's the longest running dictatorship in the hemisphere, one of the oldest in the world. And the persecution that people in general, but especially people of faith and Christians, continue facing in Cuba has not changed. It has gotten worse. However, there's been a process of whitewashing the Cuban regime that has resulted since the relations with the Vatican were, established back in 1998 with the visit of John Paul II. Fidel Castro had initially been excommunicated in the 60s, 62, for his support of communist ideology and all of the killings and everything that took place in the beginning of the revolution. So That changed after John Paul II visited. And what's been happening is the perception that Cuba still persecutes Christians and people in the same way has changed. And sadly, the Vatican's failed attempts at diplomacy, and the Vatican wanting to be a mediator when it comes to the United States and Cuba, and using that way instead of just condemning Cuba for what it is, which is a dictatorship. Again, the longest running dictatorship in the continent. It has had terrible consequences. We have over 1,200 political prisoners, many of which are priests and pastors and people of faith. You cannot post or say the wrong thing online, and this goes mainly for churches as well. They're monitored. They have people infiltrated. It's just a terrible situation all around. And the purpose of my article was to basically call on the Vatican and just hope that approach is changed, and remind them that they are a moral compass for the world and for Cubans as well. And we're hoping that they will stand once again with the people and just condemn the Cuban dictatorship, and realize that attempts of diplomacy with a dictatorship, they're just not effective. Sadly,
Yeah.
It's been tried.
Let me hop in here and let's go back, because when I read your article, I was kind of surprised. And this is a very American thing, right? Well, Obama opened it up and he normalized relationships with Cuba and everything's fine now. And then I read your article. I was like, oh, okay, things are not fine because there's political prisoners taking place, right? So, Fidel Castro died. I don't even know if Castro is Raul still in charge in Cuba. Like, who is ruling the Cuban people? Who's in charge of the dictatorship, and what is the condition within Cuba right now?
So we have a president that obviously no one voted for. Díaz-Canel is his last name, but Raul Castro is still alive. He's still in power. So he still rules the country.
Okay.
We just have this face that is presented as, the president. But repression has gotten worse with the internet and things being more open now. And, the crackdown on social media and information has just gotten worse. So after the protests of July 11th in 2021, where thousands of people took to the streets for the first time in decades, which was unheard of, everything has gotten worse. And especially for people of faith, again, priests and pastors are still in jail from that day. People that dared voice their support for the Cuban people are still paying the consequences. So that's pretty much what it looks like today in Cuba. Nothing has changed.
So what is life like for the average Cuban? I mean, when you were there, your family, what does that look like? I mean, Americans kind of have this memory of, oh, well, they all drive cars from the 50s and life used to be great. Now it's bad. But tell us a little bit. I know the pandemic there was really hard for people that lived in Cuba. What's daily life like there right now?
So right now it's more difficult than ever, even so considering the special period that came after the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 90s. It's still worse now because, time has passed, and basically the Cuban government controls all the infrastructure that it cannot maintain. No amount of donations and aid that are received are enough. Cuba receives over $3 billion just worth of remittances and donations yearly, and none of that will be enough. We have rolling blackouts again. Communities can stay 2, 3, 4 days more without electricity. That's just normal. We just had another massive blackout on the 14th. So I believe it's 90-something% of the population was in the dark. It was absolutely not even in a war zone. You see these things. Yeah. So there is no fuel. You see very few of these cars on the roads anymore. Sadly, they're also really costly to maintain. There's no food. And again, your freedom of expression and freedom of religion, it's just getting tougher for everyday Cubans.
How is that so the freedom of speech piece? Like, I could see, does Facebook participate in the oppression of people, or how do people communicate? That, are there monitors everywhere like you would think about North Korea? Like, how does that work? How does the oppression and the suppression of speech take place?
The government controls absolutely everything. So they have an entire school called OC where IT it's studied, and they monitor everything that goes in and out. So let's say you as a church, if now you're going to put a message online, if you're going to put a message in support of Israel, and you cannot do that. Everything has to follow their script, and everything has to show support for the government. Last year, they actually made it illegally, so now it's an actual felony, and you will go to jail for posting the wrong thing on social media. Now, they've always done this since 1959. People would go all the time to prison for saying the wrong thing, going out with a sign. But now they've made it into an actual law. I believe it's up to 7 years that you can face imprisonment for sharing or posting the wrong thing or being heard saying the wrong thing. So the crackdown has just gotten worse. And it's a response to the more open society, I guess, that we have now. Fidel Castro, it was a different time, but they were more successful in keeping Cuba shut from the rest of the world. Whereas now, you do get a lot of that outside influence, and people have social media still, and they use VPN, and they're able to see what life looks like outside. So people are harder to control the more information they have. And so, yeah.
So the religious aspect, I mean, Christians obviously are persecuted in any kind of authoritarian system. Because faith in anything other than the government and the authoritarian system is obviously sinful to the authoritarian.
Yes.
But also just as a gathering place, so tell us your experience with, now you mentioned that you became a Christian in 21. I'd love to hear that story. And I'd love to, was that here in America? Was that in Cuba? Were you an atheist in Cuba that was a I'd love to hear a little bit about your faith journey before we talk about the faithful in Cuba.
For sure. So my story is it's kind of funny. I was raised an atheist. Again, religion was pretty much removed entirely from society after 1959. And so my family that used to be Catholic, and my parents were raised atheists. And so that's how I grew up. Now, my first experience with the Catholic Church was in Cuba. I studied as part of one for a few years, 2 years. I studied English. But it didn't have anything to do with faith, to be honest. It was just a great place to study because churches have, agreements with nonprofits and international organizations. And so they offered courses that you were not able to access otherwise. You were able to study business, you could study English, and good programs too. So that was my first experience with the church. But it was that was just about it. I moved to the Cayman Islands when I was 24. I was working as a waitress for a hotel restaurant, and that was my first running with a Christian church that a friend took me to, which I also loved. But again, it was more about the desire to help out and get involved in, the community and things of that nature than really thinking about my relationship with Christ and what that looks like. And did I believe in God? And did I dare admit to myself that I believed in God? Because I was raised in a society that really does separate, the scientific from religion, and anything religion related is just attributed to ignorance, pretty much. Yeah. So there was a lot of questions in my head about God at the time, but I never dared address them. Then I got older, moved to the United States at the end of 2019. And what happened in 2021 is, I had met my now husband, and we've been talking. He was raised Catholic, but again, he didn't have a personal relationship with Christ. And so we had been talking about the questions we both had. And I said, we should find a home church. And we were kind of in conversations when it came to that. When one day I was driving on the road and he was next to me having lunch. We were on our way to sign actually off on our new home. We were excited. And so I got into a car accident is what happened. I bumped into the truck in front of me because I did not realize that the light had turned red. So that was really scary. This is a super busy highway in the middle of Austin, Texas. And I get out of the car so nervous, about to cry, thinking, oh my gosh, I just damaged this amazing truck. I'm going to get screamed at. And when I exit the car, I find an elderly couple standing there, and the gentleman is holding a Gideon Testament, so one of the little Bibles.
Yeah. Like you can find in a hotel for those that aren't familiar.
Correct. Yes. They're an amazing organization. My husband is now, after all of that, he's actually a Gideon. So, so yeah, I get off the car and then I approach him like, I'm so sorry, but like, we'll, give you the insurance information. I didn't know how sorry I am. And he was just, don't worry about it. It's something minor. It's just a tail light. We'll get it fixed. Have you heard about the good news of our Lord and Savior Jesus? I was like, huh? But are we doing this in the middle of the highway? And he just asked us basically, do you have a home church? And they just invited us to their church. And I couldn't stop thinking about it. My husband was working that following weekend, but I said, there has to be a reason this happened. Not only have we been talking about this, but also I'm such a careful driver, honestly. And I just could not believe that happened to me. So I went to church, and that was the beginning of a relationship with this couple and their family, their children. And a few years later, we got married at their kids' property house here in Austin. He was one of the officiants of our wedding. We have a great relationship. He introduced Daniel to the Gideons, and my husband and I both accepted Christ like a few months after that, after sort of finding a good home church and church community and getting some of those questions answered. And it's just been incredible.
That's really great. Yeah, there are no coincidences. Do you know Spike Cohen, the ran for vice president, big libertarian guy? He recently just committed to Christ, and he found in his dad's belongings, his dad sadly just passed away, that he had committed to Christ 50 years to the day before Spike did. Just one of those amazing little things that are not coincidences.
Not coincidences. I agree.
Beautiful little happenings.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, every story of conversion is just so incredible, I feel. And that was the beginning. We've been blessed enough to be testimony speakers as well for the Gideons in some of their conventions and, pastors' lunches. And we're happy because my husband is Venezuelan and I'm Cuban. So we actually get to share some of what happens in our home countries and what it looks like today to be people of faith in these countries, and try to raise whatever awareness we can.
Now, we didn't anticipate evangelizing here, but I'm so glad that you could share that story, and I really appreciate it. I think it's a beautiful story and amazing. And I wonder, like, when you were in Cuba, we actually have a very similar story. I was an atheist until I was 18. I was raised here in America, and the cultural messages, very science-based and be true to yourself. A lot of, the worldview that I think you get if you're just not religious, right?
Yes.
And what was the world, if you live in Cuba, like, are they still communist? Like, are you still given, like, the party is your religion, or there's no religion? Like in Russia, we met a Russian couple on our honeymoon, and they're like, we don't celebrate Christmas. We have New Year's. That's the celebration. And I read in your article that, like, you couldn't even celebrate Christmas in Cuba, and the Vatican helped negotiate that you could start celebrating. So is Christianity or religion in general just not a function of daily life there, or is it very underground? Like, what does that look like if you're a person of any faith, but especially a Christian in Cuba?
Right. So that has changed over the years in different ways. They're still persecuted, but it has changed. When Fidel came to power in 1959, he decided to make Cuba an atheist state. Because obviously religion is everything opposed, to Marxism. And he found the greatest threat to be the Catholic Church. Because again, biggest church in the world, massive influence. And when people have, in this case, Christ at the center of their lives, then they don't have men and they don't have the government, and they're self-sufficient. And you try to have a nuclear family, which is also something they absolutely targeted, because they needed everyone dependent on the government. So, single moms and abortion policies were starting to be pushed to the population. So early on, he banned Christmas. All the religious schools were closed. People had to remove all religious images from their houses. People actually had to create underground churches at their homes, where they hosted mass, weddings, even funerals. I saw an interview of a lady recently. They hosted funerals because you were not able to do that. So people of faith were not allowed to join the Communist Party. There was huge stigma You would lose your job. Your kids would not be able to go to university. There was like serious repercussions with being associated with people of faith. There were a lot of religious people were also sent to the labor camps that were created as one of the ideas of Che Guevara, because to quote what he said, work will make them men. So they sent all the undesirables, what they call the undesirables of society, to these camps. This included people of, religious people, people with long hair, people that were gay, and artists, anyone that did not follow the specific script, looked a certain way. They were all, or believed the same message. They were all sent to these camps. And Christmas was part of that. So it was banned for 30 years in the name of prioritizing the sugar harvest. And it was only reinstated after John Paul II's visit. He was able to negotiate Cubans having Christmas Day off again. And it's a national holiday since that day. That was pretty much, it was a great thing. I remember I was very little, but I was taken to that mass when he was there. And, it was the only change, if you can call it that. It was a good thing, but it just wasn't enough. And Cubans now, today, you still have churches. They still run. There's still a stigma associated with that. They keep a very close eye on churches. They have people infiltrated, and I would say almost every single one. And I think, in my opinion, is one of the reasons why the Catholic Church in Cuba has not been as vocal as they have been in other countries, where they've been able to successfully demand more of a reaction from the Vatican. Let's say countries like Nicaragua, Colombia. Nicaragua, they've just been jailing as well, like the Catholic opposition to the government. So they're following a similar script, but the current Pope Benedict, he has condemned that after the Nicaraguan church was a bit more persistent than the Cuban church. It does matter, obviously having the backup of an organization like the Vatican and the moral leader of over 1 billion Catholics worldwide. So Cubans were just hoping to get the same from the Pope. But the church in Cuba continues to be persecuted. Again, you cannot have big congregations of people because it's illegal. You cannot post or share opinions online that could affect or go against the image that Cuba is trying to sell the world. And so that's still what that looks like. Again, Cuba in the World Watch List 2025 is the country in Latin America, in the entire hemisphere, where Christians are the most persecuted the most. Yeah. So really nothing, no good change or no permanent change has come from all these visits from popes over the years, all these relations with the Vatican. They tried to intercede during the Obama administration as well. They were a mediator for normalizing relations between the two countries, which was really one-sided. The cultural exchange and the travel and all of that, it was only for the United States. Cubans really saw no real change after that, and opening that pipeline that was opened again when the embargo measures were, softened and the restrictions were lifted, it just all went to the pockets of the dictatorship, which got richer, got stronger. And a few years after that, you actually had a lot more political prisoners than you did before. So it's just a massive failure. And now it just looks like it sort of happened again, or it was trying to happen again when Biden, during his last week of his administration, he just negotiated the removal of Cuba from the terrorism sponsors list, and also negotiated the lifting of some of the sanctions for some of the government entities, which are all of them, because they're all controlled by the government. So
so the terrorist watch list, the terrorist sponsor list, excuse me.
Yeah.
Trump puts Cuba on at the end of his first term. Biden at the end of his term. I'm just assuming his first term, probably not going to be second. But adds them back. What does the terrorist sponsor list? I mean, what terror does Cuba sponsor? And because I think of terrorists as like Muslim extremists, maybe some white supremacist groups, right? But I think Cuba.
Yeah.
Right. So is this just a ploy that the American government uses to try and control a hemispheric adversary, or is this something that they're very seriously generating terrorists around the region that we need to be concerned about? Like, fill us in on that piece, because that seems interesting to me. Why are we calling them terrorists?
That's a great question.
They're terrorizing their people, right? But are they terrorizing other countries? I guess is what's the definition here?
Well, if it was only Cubans, I guess it wouldn't be as bad. No, but there's a trickle down effect.
I hope that didn't come across.
Not at all.
Yeah,
that's a valid question. That's a valid question. Cuba has been destabilizing democracies in the hemisphere since the revolution. This is not new. They have just done such an amazing job at what they've sold to the world. And I have to give it to them. Like, Fidel Castro was a mastermind, and he was able to sell the world this idea that Cuba is this generous country that sends, doctors and teachers, and they just want to help everyone. And that is not the case. Cubans have died by the thousands trying to leave this country. Cuba has directly sponsored and taught Venezuelans that are now going through something very similar. Same with Nicaragua. We've sent guerrillas. We've supported guerrillas all over the continent. All of this has had a direct effect in the mass migration crisis that we're seeing in the United States. All the Venezuelans you have coming through the border, all the terror state that is moving here, all of that has played in favor of the Cuban government and has been part of their plan all along. It's also not a coincidence that every time there's been a democratic precedent, for whatever reason, they choose to lift sanctions, and Cuba presses the most. So, they lift restrictions, they lift travel restrictions for Cubans. And so they absolutely need to be on the terrorism sponsors list. It matters because it also matters how the world continues supporting and this type of organizations, and they continue receiving aid. That the perception of the rest of the world, it's what's most important to them right now, because they've been so affected by the campaigns that even like the same us Cubans that have left are trying to just be honest and be open and tell the rest of the world what's happening. And sadly, no, you cannot. It's almost impossible sending aid and money to a place like Cuba and keep it from falling into the hands of the government, because they control absolutely everything. So having them on a list of people that sponsor terrorism, it keeps some of the bans and economic, restrictions in place, which we absolutely need. And sadly, it's the reason every time they lift these sanctions and every time they lift these bans and every time any country continues negotiating with the Cuban government, the dictatorship just stays in power longer and longer. And that's how they've managed. Cuba produces virtually nothing today, but they managed to stay in power. So
let's go to Pope Francis, because I think there's a lot of things I respect about Pope Francis, but I also think there's a lot of criticism of Pope Francis that seems to stick. Like, Pope John Paul is considered this lion for freedom who helps bring down the Soviet Union. And I think Francis wants to be, Ratzinger was really focused on the internal workings of the church. And Pope Francis seems to be someone that wants to use his influence for the poor and the marginalized, that's what Christ teaches. That's exactly where he ought to be. But I think he also sometimes comes across as pretty ineffective. And you were fairly critical of Pope Francis in these negotiations between the United States, Cuba, the Vatican, of Pope Francis. Why were you critical? What do you think he's doing that he ought to be doing, and what should he do less of?
I mean, I think the approach that the Vatican has taken during his papacy has just not been effective. And time after time again, it just shows that you sadly cannot negotiate with terrorists. I agree, obviously, 100%. The Cuban people deserve a better life. And that's, I think, a fight that we all of us have in common, Christians, people of good in general. But continuing to mediate in these diplomatic efforts that just benefit the Cuban government only, it continues setting us back. So he has been very vocal. It's not that they don't get involved in politics, let's say. So Pope Francis can, in fact, he has denounced, for example, Trump's new travel immigration policies and the mass deportation. So he has come out and stated that he's against that. But then he fails to denounce left-wing policies with the same strength that he denounces right-wing policies. So it does show a bias, in my opinion, because they can and they do get involved in politics. And so, yeah, I mean, his efforts have just proven to fail. And what I'm hoping to do, because I have huge respect, again, for the Pope and for the Vatican, I'm hoping to show that there's a need to tackle things in a different way and to perhaps to condemn the dictatorship for what it is. And if you're going to allow for the Cuban government to use your name as a mediator in any of these efforts, at the very least, you have to stand by that. And in this last case, when it came to the 553 people, political prisoners that were supposed to be released, as soon as Trump put Cuba back on that list, the releases stopped. So at the very least, they need to come out and demand that they go through with the agreement, because it was not supposed to be. It was supposed to be in the spirit of Jubilee, right? Quoting the Vatican. So then I believe they've resumed some of the releases. Now, most of them have not been political prisoners. Their sentences remain intact. So they've been put on the streets just on their warnings that, you're temporarily out pretty much, but you have to be mindful of what you say and do. So you're not really free to be anyways. So if the Vatican is going to allow to be named as a mediator in these efforts, then they also have to stand by that and say, okay, we said 553, where are they? We said political prisoners. These are not political prisoners. I'm happy if the innocent are coming out, but we have to call it for what it is. Cuba is a country where Christians have no rights. There is no freedom of religion, not really. There is no human rights are not respected. And the Vatican has done that in the past, and they have done that in several other instances today. And so there's no reason, if they can do it with Nicaragua and they can do it with Mexico and they can do it with Colombia, they can do it with Cuba. There seems to be a different kind of treatment when it comes to the Cuban government. And just the fact that they refuse to call Canel and Castro the same way that they call
it's coddle left, punch right. Yeah, I think we're all kind of guilty. I tend to punch right, coddle left. I'm a member of the right, so it makes me crazy that my own people are crazy sometimes. Right. But yeah, I think it's coddle left, punch right is the criticism of Pope Francis a lot of times.
Yeah, and honestly, again, it's not that they don't get what I hear coming in defense of the Vatican is a lot of, they don't need to get involved in politics, but they do. The church is not just religion; they do get involved with a lot of human rights causes and politics, and they still do today. So why fail to condemn something for what it really is, especially when that's the root cause for so much of what happens in our own continent. So in order for Cuba to one day be free, even the religious movement in Cuba, the Catholic Church also needs to feel emboldened. And I believe this is what happened as well, in the times of John Paul and what happened in Poland, and the nationalist movements, they were emboldened and empowered by having a church that had a clear stand and that supported them and that told them, do not be afraid. And I believe these were his words, right? And so the church today needs that as well. The Cuban church needs that today more than ever. And that's why I'm hoping, even though I'm not a Catholic myself, I understand the power of the Catholic Church. I love my Catholic brothers and sisters. And so we do need them. We need them on our side, and we need them to take a strong stance when it comes to the Cuban dictatorship and call it for what it is.
Yeah, wherever human beings are being mistreated and abused by their government, Christians of all stripes should stand up and support them.
Correct.
So I want to go back to something you said about, because I'm not going to get political, I might get a little political, but I think you have a unique perspective of somebody that I probably never have a chance to really talk to. So I want to ask you this question, because I think we're Americans are very uncomfortable with our polarization, right?
Yes.
I was having a conversation today with Brian Nichols, who took over the We Are Libertarians Facebook page. Now he runs it. It's 100,000 people. That page made me not want to be a professional talk radio person, because I got I peeked over the mountaintop and I saw how awful everyone is and how violent people truly are. And I was like, I don't want to subject my family to that, and pulled back. And I'm happy with the audience I have. But, you know, the left is ready to burn down Teslas. The right is ready to light, you know, John Roberts' house on fire. There's just this tension in the society that we have that we're not used to. I did not grow up with this. We don't know how to deal with it and process it. I would imagine, being an uneducated rube of your life circumstances, that if someone were in my church that were spying for the government, we tend to think that our government has so much money that they will pay people to spy on us, right? All these libertarian podcasters think they have a Fed assigned to them. You don't. But like, it's just somebody was paid to be a crisis actor in these situations.
Right.
I don't think that. I think there are true believers, left or right, that will participate in evil when given the chance. And we have two sides trying to see who's going to control that gun. And so what does the person that goes into a Christian church to spy for their government look like? How does that person make the decision to be that person? Is it a paying job? It's a financial incentive? Is it a true believer's incentive? Is it, right? Like, because I think that's an interesting psychology that we are developing here. You tell me if I'm wrong, but people will do and participate in terrible, evil things for their government because of certain factors. And I think that's a newer, well, I don't know that that's a newer thing. I think if you ask the Black community, that's a long-standing American tradition. What are your thoughts on that? Am I just being Glenn Beck paranoiac, or are you concerned about the health of America? And then, what does that person look like that participates in spying on other members of their church?
Well, that could be anyone. It does not necessarily need to be someone that's paid. People will do, like you said, anything. People will engage in the most evil acts because they're threatened, because they basically have you kidnapped. They have your family. They have your future on their hands. They're the only ones that will allow you to travel, leave, eat, have a good job, maybe have a car. So it's very easy to manipulate someone when you have their entire lives on their hands. Beyond that as well, people sometimes still believe. I do think that people will do anything for a certain social status or for what they think will give them a certain social status. If you align yourself with a certain perspective and now you're a justice warrior, then that will bring people to do the craziest things. And that has been the case since the revolution. You would be surprised.
Even with all the evidence around you that this is a failed state and this ideology is oppressive, there are still people who believe. There's still people.
There will always be people will talk to me and defend, socialism, and they'll defend communism every day. And I always say, when you hear someone that's in shock because of what happened, let's say Nazi Germany, and they say, I would have never done all of this. Yes, you would have. You would have engaged in what they sell to you, and they package this nicely as, social justice, and, you have to defend your country, and these are your people, and this is the 1%, and we have to go against the 1%, and they have to pay for what they've done to you, and they're the reason you're poor. And you are doing it today, not to the same level, because that's not what's happening here. But it's not that different. So they would absolutely have engaged in that behavior if they happen to be German, and at the time, and they do it today as well. So in Cuba, I don't think it's many, because I would say the average young Cuban is just looking for a way out. And the government knows that, and they know how to show you every opportunity that you could have if you just inform for them. Just become a member of this church for a year, and then you'll be able to go on this mission. And if you're a doctor or if you're a teacher, you'll be able to travel, or, your wife has been wanting to travel for this time, we'll let her. So it's very easy to do that, and here the polarization, it did take me by surprise, to be honest. And I've heard from other people, I wasn't here, but I've heard that it wasn't always like this.
Yeah, not at all.
Not at all.
It really wasn't. And this is why so many people don't like Trump, is it was always there. Trump speaks like every talk radio caller I screened in 2004. It just was not as naked and as amplified. Like, there's an amplification that I do think comes from Russia and Chinese influence on social media that makes it feel so much worse. But yeah, it was not. It's like somebody put a brick on the gas pedal in 2008 and never took it off.
Never took it off. And again, Cuba, I'm going to take it back to Cuba, because in our entire continent, it didn't used to be the case, but the amount of support you still find in a lot of countries. There's a socialist epidemic in Latin America. And a lot of them have fallen for what Cuba promised. And all of these policies have destabilized economies, have destabilized societies. And now they're all here. Everyone comes here. So it does matter. I think if anything has been proven in recent years is that, sadly, it does matter what happens in your continent. I do think the United States has had its eyes off of Cuba and off of the continent and off of the powerful socialist alliance that was forming here. And now, until it knocks on the door, and you have like mass migration and drug trafficking and so many crimes being committed by illegal aliens and all of this out of control. A lot of people just woke up and they're like, oh, wait a minute, how did this happen? And it's been happening for a long time. The Cuban government has a lot of people infiltrated here too. It's not just the church, and it's not just back home. Some of them are arrested on the news sometimes, and they're here. They're in universities, they're in the government. So all the sympathizing that you see with socialist ideas, and it comes from somewhere. It comes all the Bernie Sanders supporters and all the, the Soviet Union got this right and that right. It's not an accident. And Cuba has been, again, they've been the masterminds behind it all, because people usually point, China, Russia, nobody points at Cuba. And they're still there. They're kind of like, tucked in the backseat, while the Vatican is other organizations are condemning Venezuela and Nicaragua and, again, Russia. Cuba's just sitting there. And they've managed to do that. And so I'm not sure how, hopefully the polarization that's here today, it's going to be fixed. I think it's going to take a while, because it didn't happen overnight. And a lot of these policies, countries like mine, again, have been destabilizing democracies for decades. And they've planted people that have been in their jobs for 30, 40 years. It won't be easy to know who they are, and they'll continue pushing these policies. I think the only way to counter that is through the younger generations, and just re-educating the population, because they are the voters of tomorrow. They are, and that's why I think it's so important what organizations like the Dissident Project do. You have to speak to the younger audiences.
Plug them, and then I've got one last question. I know you probably have to go, and I've got an interview in 15 minutes, but I can talk to you for like another 2 hours. What is the Dissident Project?
The Dissident Project is an organization that puts people like me that have fled totalitarian regimes in touch with student audiences, so high school students. And we talk to them about our experiences living under socialist policies and communist policies and authoritarian governments, and what that looks like, and hopefully educate them so they are informed voters in the future. And so they have a fresh, real perspective from people who actually come from these countries, because there has been a lot of whitewashing, many of them, and Cuba is the chief amongst them, I would say. So that's the work that the Dissident Project hopes to do at no charge for schools. We speak to student audiences and answer their questions and tell them our stories, and hope to change things. And I've been seeing a change already. So they are doing a fantastic work.
Okay, so in your comments, I heard concern about more leftist things, right? And I think when the conversation, I look at like Donald Trump, and I'm like, all right, I don't like the breakdown of the rule of law. I'm concerned about this, that. I'd love to hear your perspective on Trump, not just as an immigrant and the immigration policies, but just more broadly, like when you see people on the left panicking about Donald Trump taking us to a banana republic, how do you interpret that?
Well, My perspective may be a little unique. I've never been a fan of Donald Trump, let's say. Myself, if I could pick the ideal candidate, let's say, which would be a conservative, it would look perhaps differently. Now, I don't have to love Donald Trump to know that this was the absolute best decision the voters could have made for the country and for the world, to be honest. Latin America desperately needed a strong president in the United States. Everything that has happened over the past 4 years, and even before that, again, what happened in Cuba with Obama, all these administrations that have taken a softer stance on totalitarian governments like mine have just enriched the pockets of those enemies of the United States and enemies of liberty and freedom just everywhere in the world. So I don't have to be a Trump fan to know that I believe, is what the country needed today. And, the values that the Republican Party, at least in their majority, they try to stand for and they try to advocate for. The world needs that, and Latin America needs that. I do think there's already a shift. You can already see it in the way that presidents like Maduro are speaking and presidents like mine are speaking. It's a completely different way, even with the tariff conversation, which I also have maybe a unique...
You look at the Colombian, no, don't say this tariff. Let me see my plane.
That's what I'm saying. So even if they're not implemented at the end, tariffs serve a purpose. And I am all up for free trade and economic freedom. And I understand the value and the importance of that. However, free trade, you have to be careful with it, because you cannot embolden and enrich your enemy, because then at the end of the day or later on, you will pay a higher price than just the short-term higher prices for a few products. So one has to be very careful when we speak of, freely trading with countries like mine or Venezuela or even Mexico. Free trade is not a right, I always say, and it's an agreement. And I do think economic freedom is not only about free trade or no tariffs, but it's also about each of the parties being able to control the terms of that engagement, and just it needs to serve both of us, and it needs to be continuously reviewed. So if there's a crisis at the border and one of the governments is not going to cooperate, then we need to have a conversation on what that's looking like. And I believe there's already been a few changes there with the 10,000 extra soldiers that were sent to the border after Donald Trump threatened with the tariffs. I think, if I'm not mistaken, in just the 1.5 months since that debate has been going on, the city of Juarez, which has been pretty much run by cartel, homicide rates have dropped by a third in just the 1 month, because you have a lot more police presence and vehicles being monitored. So even the debate on tariffs, it does matter. It does matter the attitude that the president of the United States has with the governments in the continent. And as a reminder that we need, if it's a partnership, we need to be partners. And no, I'm not going to finance you going against me. I'm not going to make my adversary stronger, because I will pay a higher price at the end of that.
Yeah, I think that's a thread that I've heard throughout that. And so your view doesn't surprise me, because we're enriching the Cuban government. Yes. Okay, we can open this up, but we're going to make the people who are oppressive rich. I don't like exactly. That, right? Yeah. How would very quickly, how would you if the Constitution, I don't know if we even read it, so you can be president now. So what would you do in terms of Cuban policy? Do you keep blockades? Do you keep pressure on them? How do you deal with it?
I would absolutely keep pressure on them. There's not enough. There's starting to be, again, they're back on the terrorism sponsors list. The embargo measures are still up. We're hoping for more pressure. Again, that's the purpose of the article with the Vatican. We're hoping that the Vatican and the Catholic Church are going to stand behind the Cuban people and also apply international pressure, because it's necessary. Because opening any kind of pipeline that brings money, if it was going to the Cuban people, if the amount of aid that's been sent to Cuba, the billions and billions and billions of dollars that have been sent to Cuba over the past 40 decades since it's possible to send aid. If that was going to make a difference, Cuba would be prosperous and would be free. So sadly, that it just doesn't work that way. And if that was going to work after Obama, it would have gotten better, and it got a lot worse. So definitely hoping that we're going to keep, just the measures in place, as long as the Cuban government keep people imprisoned and kidnapped, and Cubans have no right to free elections and to freedom of speech and religion, then, no free trade, tariffs on, and hopefully that will help embolden the Cuban people to make a change, a permanent change at some point.
Yeah. So one last question again.
Of course.
Would you say that it is fair that, I think if you just read the New York Times and you listen to this interview, you go, here's an immigrant who's pro Donald Trump. What's that about? Would it be fair to say that because you have lived through a leftist regime that you're like, I'm really skeptical of leftism in general and its power? Reconcile that for the listener. I think that's such an interesting point of view.
For sure. I would have never described myself as a Trump supporter. I don't even think I still do. But as you said, you will always find me on. And
I don't think that I got Trump supporter from that. I don't want you to think.
Right. No, that's fine. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but it's just you will always find me on the opposite end of whatever leftist policy is trying to be passed. Now, why the Democratic Party or why the Democratic leaders in the past and, in the more recent past as well have been so keen on doing, trades with the Cuban government and sympathizing with the leftist dictatorships in the world, I do not know. Do I wish that was not the case? Absolutely. And maybe in the past it wouldn't have been. I know that Obama, he got a lot of Cubans behind him because I believe he came out and sort of voiced his support for the Cuban freedom movement. If that was true or not, in the end, that's a different question. But Cubans are willing. We are willing to stand behind the people with the right speech and the right priorities. And sadly, the Democratic Party of today, you see all this support for, again, leftist, anti-family.
It's sort of funny when the Democratic National Convention comes out and has flags and freedom, and you're like, you're doing liberty now? Like, this is a tea party? Like, I don't think we felt like that. We've associated you with that for 20 years. Like, what are you doing?
And so whenever they do that'll be great. And then I guess we Cubans will have the, you can go back to maybe thinking of voting for Democratic president if that were to be the case. You would think that, again, supporting totalitarianism, that would just not be a partisan issue. Supporting socialism and communism and all these ideologies that have resulted in millions and millions of deaths, you would think that would not be a partisan problem, but it is. And so here we are. That is the case,
You're a great spokesman for freedom, and I really do appreciate your time. Tell us where we can follow you, Gaby.
You can follow me on Instagram. I'm Gaby Blanco. You can find me on X as well, _Gaby Blanco. And most importantly, you can find the Dissident Project, again, in all social medias, Facebook, Instagram, X. And you can get in touch with any of our speakers. We'll come to your school. We'll talk to the kids. We'll answer their questions. And hopefully we can prevent what happened in Cuba from continuing to happen in countries like the US and anywhere else in the world. And we can have informed voters in the future that love freedom and family and hopefully Christ. But that's just me throwing my 2 cents in there.
You're going to see them one way or the other.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you, Gaby. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
And thank you for watching The Chris Spangle Show. If you learned something, if you felt that this was of value, and I certainly do, then please share it with your friends. That's the best way for any podcast, but especially this one, to grow. Thank you so much for watching The Chris Spangle Show.